Good morning. My name is Joe Micallef. I am one of the resident historians for Viking, and today I'm going to give a short talk on Boston, New England, and the birth of the United States. I'm not going to deal with the actual American Revolution. Rather, what I'm going to look at is both the broad historical forces that shaped and set the stage for the revolution, and then the specific events that led to the actual beginning of the American War of Independence. Specifically, we're going to look at the roots of Anglo-French rivalry. Then we're going to take a deep dive into the French and Indian War, which really was a prerequisite for the American War of Independence. And then finally, we'll look at Boston and the road to revolution, and specifically the tax revolt, the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, and then Lexington and Concord. Each of those four events represents an escalation in what would ultimately become the War of American Independence. And each of those events occurred in Boston or in the immediate community. So Boston was very much the centerpiece of the events that would eventually lead to the American Revolt. Let me start by looking at the roots of Anglo-French rivalry. Between 1066 and 1815, England, and then later Great Britain, would fight 41 wars with France, beginning with the Norman invasion in 1066, followed by 23 wars to dominate France from roughly 1109 through 1560, and those wars also include the period that's called the 100 Years' War, which actually was not a war that lasted 100 years. It was a series of wars over a period slightly longer than 100 years. Then there was English intervention in two civil wars of religion in France from 1589 through 1628. And finally, and most importantly, there were 15 wars that begin with the reign of Louis XIV and would finally end with the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, a period that spans roughly 1666 through 1815, almost 150 years, where England was locked in an existential struggle with France, both to prevent French domination of the European continent and also to prevent France from being in a position where it could actually stage an invasion of Great Britain. From 1628 to 1689, the period is described as one of the small wars. There was a series of relatively minor conflicts in Europe as France essentially began its ascendancy as Spain declined over the course of the 17th century. After 1689, however, the conflict becomes much more intense, and it really begins with the Glorious Revolution in England, the overthrow of James II and the ascension of William and Mary, the first, or the restoration of the Protestant monarchy in England. James II and the previous Catholic monarchs had been secretly subsidized by Louis XIV, who had hoped to bring England into an anti-Spanish alliance with France. After the Glorious Revolution, any prospect of that becomes impossible. And so what happens from 1689 through 1815 is really a series of wars where France tries to dominate the European continent, and England and various allies position themselves to prevent that. It starts with King William's War, or at least that's what it was called in North America. In Europe, it was known as the War of the League of Augsburg from 1689 to 1697 in response to Louis XIV's attempt to seize the Rhineland across the Rhine River in what was then the Habsburg Empire. This is how Alsace first became part of France, an issue that would dominate Franco-German relations for the next 300 years. The wars in North America were known by the monarch that was reigning at the time. So the next war, Queen Anne's War, or the War of the Spanish Succession, lasts from 1702 to 1712. That's followed by the War of the Austrian Succession, or King George's War, from 1744 through 1748. And then we finally come to the French and Indian War from 1756 to 1763, which was also known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. This was the first war between England and France that actually started in North America. And in North America, it only actually lasted for 4 years. But in Europe and elsewhere in the world, it lasted for 7 years. And this was followed by the American War of Independence from 1775 to 1783, and then the Bourbon War from 93 to 1803, and the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815. So the French and Indian War and the American War of Independence are really just two conflicts in a much larger series of conflicts that would dominate Anglo-French relations from really the late 17th century all the way through the early 18th century or 19th century. The French and Indian War was the most far-reaching of the Anglo-French wars to date. It was the first world war. It was a war that was fought literally all over the world, from North America to South America to Asia, and of course in Europe. As a consequence of that war, France lost its North American empire, and that war would set the stage that would ultimately culminate in the American Revolutionary War. It was also a period where many prominent Revolutionary War leaders would first come to public attention. From the late 17th century through the mid-18th century, France represented an existential threat to the British colonies on North America. Not only did the French colonies hem in the British colonies to the north and to the west, but the French were also the primary supplier of arms to the Native Americans along the western frontier. So France was always an existential threat to the American colonies. Now, what's remarkable about what would happen during this period is that in the space of roughly 13 years, France goes from being an existential enemy of the American colonies to being an existential ally for the colonies in their war of independence against Great Britain. The fact that this occurred in the space of 13 years after a century and a half of unremitting hostility between France and the American colonies is really quite remarkable. The war highlighted the strategic importance of the Ohio and the Hudson valleys. During the winter, the St. Lawrence Seaway typically would freeze over. Remember, this is the 17th and 18th centuries when Europe, or at least the Northern Hemisphere, was undergoing what climatologists call the Little Ice Age. So it was quite common for the St. Lawrence Seaway to or the St. Lawrence River rather, to freeze over, preventing the passages of ships over the course of the winter. From Sorel, just north of Montreal, you could follow the Richelieu River down to Lake Champlain, and from there connect in Albany with the Hudson River, which would take you all the way down to New York. Now, this was a strategic waterway and really passageway because, first of all, if the French were succeeded in taking Fort Albany, there would be nothing to stop them between Albany and New York City. And that would effectively split the 13 colonies into two groups. Secondly, it represented the only warm water port that was readily accessible to the French colonists in Quebec, because had they been able to take that strategic waterway and take control of New York City, it would have given them a port that was open year-round that they could have used when the St. Lawrence was frozen over. The second strategic area was the Ohio River, because the Ohio River Valley represented the link between the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi. Now, rivers and their drainages were particularly important during this period for three reasons. First of all, it was the basis for land claims. The idea that an explorer could stand on the banks of a river and claim all of the waters drained by that river and all of the lands drained by that river for their monarch strikes us as being rather fanciful today, but at the time, that was in fact a legitimate basis on which land claims could have been made. Secondly, the primary source of wealth in North America was the fur trade, and the fur-bearing animals generally inhabited areas around water. And so control of the rivers and all of their tributaries also gave those countries control of the fur trade that was based on those rivers. And finally, the rivers represented a transportation highway. So in the case of the Ohio River, with a little judicious porting, you could actually make your way from the St. Lawrence all the way to the Mississippi, and then down the Mississippi to New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico. So control of those rivers and their drainages was of critical importance for all of these reasons. Starting in the mid-18th century, the French built a series of forts to secure the Ohio Valley, 4 forts in total, along a path called the Venango Path. Now, bear in mind that the original colonial charters to the colonies never specified a western boundary. At the time, no one really understood just how wide North America was. And so the presumption was that the colonial holdings, the colonial charters, gave each of those colonies all of the land to the west of them until they ran out of land. So the French claims on the Ohio Valley essentially conflicted with claims that the colony of Virginia felt it already had in that area by virtue of the charter that had originally set up the Virginia colony. So the French built a series of 4 forts, starting at Fort Duquesne at the juncture of the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers, in what was called the Forks of the Ohio, which is where the Allegheny River and the Monongahela River come together. Today, this is where Pittsburgh is located. They also built forts at Fort Machaut on French Creek and on the Allegheny River, at Fort Le Boeuf on French Creek, and Fort Presqu'Isle on Lake Erie and Presqu'Isle Bay. Now, Virginia, or a group of Virginians, which included included the governor and a lot of leading Virginia families, including the Washingtons, had organized and obtained a charter from England to create the Ohio Company, which was granted 500,000 acres in the Ohio Valley. And the intent was to basically subdivide this area and make it available to settlers from Virginia. George Washington's brother was a investor in the Ohio Company, and George Washington himself was believed to have been an investor, but was also one of the surveyors employed by the Ohio Company to explore and decide how this region should have been divided up. So the French forts were in direct conflict with the land that was being claimed by the Ohio Company and by all of the Virginians who were investors in the Ohio Company. So in December of 1753, George Washington, all of 21 years old and a major in the Virginia militia, is instructed by the Virginia governor, Dinwiddie, to make a trip to Fort Le Boeuf to demand that the French leave. He does that. The French commander is polite, but basically says no, and insists that the French are going to stay in the forts that they've already built. So Washington returns to Virginia, and a few months later, now a newly minted colonel in the Virginia militia, is given a force of 160 men with orders to build a road to the Monongahela River and to create fortifications along that road to be able to defend it. This is George Washington's first military command. So on this expedition, George Washington and his soldiers run into a small French force led by Joseph de Jumonville. Now, neither the French nor the Americans are really looking for a fight, and both would have just gone on their own way. But a group of Native Americans that were traveling with Washington descend on the French force and kill them. Washington realizes that this is going to require a response from the French, and so he retreats from his position 37 miles south of where the French have built their forts, and he builds a new fort, a very simple structure, which he calls Fort Necessity. And they clear the area around the fort to prevent the French soldiers from approaching the fort itself. But when the French finally show up, Washington realizes that the tree line is within range of the French musketeers, so they can hide along the tree line and shoot at the fort, which means that, in effect, Washington's position is doomed, because the French can just stay there surrounding the fort and shooting at it until Washington is forced to give up. And so on July the 4th, the next day, Washington surrenders. This was the only surrender by George Washington in his military career. It was also the surrender that followed his first military command. So Washington is allowed to leave, the fort is abandoned, and he returns to Virginia. In 1755, the population of French Canada, what today would be essentially the provinces of Quebec and portions of eastern Ontario, numbered about 75,000 people. Acadia, which included present-day Nova Scotia and the Maritime provinces, was about 10,000, and Newfoundland had about another 10,000 people. So roughly about 100,000 people lived in the territories that France controlled in North America. The 13 colonies, on the other hand, had by then had a population of 1.6 million people. From 1600 to 1750, French migration to the New World averaged about 56 settlers a year. British migration averaged about 1,000 people a year. It doesn't seem like that big of a difference, but over the course of 150 years, it produces a huge imbalance in the British population of the New World versus that of the French-controlled areas. In response to what happened to Washington in the Ohio Valley, on July the 10th, 1754, representatives of 7 colonies met together in Albany in what was called the Albany Congress. Now, the purpose of the Congress was really to solidify relations with the Iroquois, which had traditionally been pro-British and who were being heavily wooed by the French to basically join their side. Now, if the Iroquois had joined with France, the position on the American frontier would have been completely untenable. So it was important for the colonies to essentially come to a modus vivendi with the Iroquois. And that Congress was attended by 150 leaders of the Iroquois nation. But one of the things that emerged from the Albany Congress was a proposal that the colonies should form a more centralized government with an American Continental Assembly under a British Governor General. And one of the people who advocated most strongly for this was an obscure printer from Philadelphia called Benjamin Franklin. It was the first time that Benjamin Franklin really came to the attention of the leaders of the other colonies. Now, had the British followed this or agreed to this proposal, which is ultimately what happened with Canada and how the Canadian government eventually was organized, the trajectory of North America could have gone in a very interesting direction. Yeah. Historians love to speculate about what if. If the British government had agreed to this proposal, then it's very likely that what would have emerged in North America would have been a sort of Canadian-like state, encompassing not only what would eventually become Canada, but most of the United States as well. The other interesting thing is that had the British government followed this course, it's very likely that the Mexican War would never have occurred. And one of the interesting consequences of the Mexican War is that the Mexican secession lands, the lands that were ceded by Mexico to the United States, represent roughly about 3/4 of America's oil reserves. So had the Mexican War never occurred, not only would you have ended up with this giant Canadian-American state in North America, but Mexico itself would have been a bona fide superpower in its own right, and would have ended up possessing among the world's largest oil reserves. But as it was, the British turned down that proposal, and the rest, as they say, is history. The Duke of Newcastle sends General Edward Braddock with a British army to the New World. And hearing of this, Louis XV dispatched an even larger French force to Canada. So what was called the French and Indian War, what would become the 7 Years' War, is the first of the Anglo-French wars that actually begins in North America, and then from North America spreads to the rest of the world. The war had 4 distinct phases. From 1754 through 1756, it really consists of a series of border skirmishes on the frontier. The British General Braddock leads an army to basically rid the Ohio Valley of the French forts, and at the Battle of Monongahela, in front of Fort Duquesne, he is killed along with 900 men. The French, rather than seeking open battle with the British, resort to guerrilla tactics, hiding behind trees and whatnot to basically pick off the British as they advance towards Fort Duquesne. The British do achieve a victory at Fort Beausejour in Acadia, in present-day Nova Scotia, but they failed to capture the great fortress of Louisbourg. Now, Louisbourg was the single largest military fortification in North America. It stood on Cape Breton and commanded the route into the St. Lawrence. It had 30-foot walls, or 30-foot high walls, and the walls at their base were 36 feet wide. It was a virtually impregnable fortress to cannon fire. The only way to take Louisbourg was to besiege it and eventually starve out the inhabitants. In the meantime, however, the British do get control of Acadia, and they proceed between 1755 and 1762 to expel all of the Acadians, the French colonists in Acadia. The French would describe this as the Great Upheaval. It was, in effect, the first ethnic cleansing in North America. The colonists were transported from 16 ships that were provided from New England. Roughly a third would end up dying in transit. A third of the Acadians would end up moving further west into other portions of French Canada, and another third would end up in the Caribbean. Now, a portion of those Acadians ended up going into the French territory of Louisiana, and that is the origin of the Louisiana Cajuns. Cajuns is essentially a contraction of Acadian, but of the 10 to 12,000 odd Acadians that were expelled by the British, less than 300 actually made their way to Louisiana, but they are in fact the source of Louisiana's Cajun community. William Pitt, the elder, now becomes Secretary of State, and Pitt decides that he is going to fight this war primarily in North America. So from 1756 to 1757, he orders an escalation of British troops in North America. In the meantime, the French are advancing down from Montreal. They take Fort Oswego in upstate New York and are beginning to threaten Fort Albany. Fort Albany is the last major fortification on the Hudson River before New York City. So if Fort Albany falls, the French can advance all the way to New York City and actually split the 13 colonies into two groups. From 1757 on, an expanded British army goes on the offensive and begins to see substantial successes. 16,000 British and colonial troops under James Abercrombie advance from Albany towards Montreal before they're finally stopped at Fort Ticonderoga, just south of what is now Lake George, New York. In the meantime, troops under General Amherst capture the great fortress of Louisburg, which opens up the St. Lawrence to invasion. Additional British troops capture Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario and Fort Duquesne in what is now Pittsburgh. Pitt appoints Amherst supreme commander of all British troops and colonial militias in North America. He also finances the recruitment of 20,000 more colonial troops. The British go on to capture Fort Niagara, and at this point, Fort Ticonderoga, which is the only fort still in French hands and guards essentially the route north to the St. Lawrence and to Montreal, is on the verge of being completely surrounded. And so the French abandon that fort and retreat to the north bank of the St. Lawrence. Shortly thereafter, James Wolfe defeats Louis-Joseph de Montcalm on the plains of Abraham, just outside Quebec, and captures the city on September the 13th. Now, there's some interesting sidebars to this story. Up until now, British attempts to penetrate the St. Lawrence were stymied by a lack of accurate nautical charts. But this time, a young lieutenant in the British Navy successfully maps out the St. Lawrence Seaway, and on the basis of those charts, the British fleet can advance and lay siege to Quebec City. That young lieutenant was named James Cook, and his skills as a cartographer and as an observer brought him to the attention of the British Admiralty, which is why a few years later he was commissioned as captain of the Endeavour, a ship charged with exploring the Pacific, and began the career of James Cook as one of the world's great explorers. The other interesting sidebar is that what was called the Plains of Abraham was really just a cow pasture that belonged to a farmer named Abraham. But the British, which always had a good sense for how to put the right spin on their victories, rather than calling it the Battle of Abraham's cow pasture, renamed it the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which makes it sound a lot more grandiose than it actually was. It wasn't much of a battle. It only lasted actually a few minutes. The British assumed their normal infantry positions. The French and their Indian allies basically rushed towards those positions pell-mell. The British line held, and when the French were almost on top of them, let loose a volley that decimated the French ranks, at which point the French and their Native American allies retreated into the city, and that was the end of the battle. It barely lasted 30 minutes. In any case, eventually Quebec City falls, and the following spring, Montreal surrenders to the British in September of 1760. That pretty much brings the French and Indian War to an end in North America. The aftermath, which lasted from roughly 1760 through 1763, has minor conflicts with the Cherokees and other Native American tribes along the western frontier. But for the most part, there are no major military operations in North America after the fall of Montreal. The war itself turns out to be a stalemate in Europe, but everywhere else, in North America, in South America, in Asia, the British are victorious. Eventually, the war comes to a close in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. Pursuant to that treaty, France ceded French Canada to Great Britain. It relinquished any claims east of the Mississippi, and to compensate Spain for having to give up Spanish Florida to Britain, it ceded the Louisiana Territory to Spain. Now, there's another interesting sidebar to what happens here, because in 1796, France and Spain sign a secret treaty called the Second Treaty of Ildefonso, where they agree that they will combine forces against Great Britain. 4 years later, in 1800, they sign the Third Treaty of Ildefonso, where Spain agrees to cede Louisiana back to France in return for certain French territories in Tuscany. Now, at the time, the French keep the Third Treaty of Ildefonso secret for fear that if word got out that Spain had given Louisiana back to France, the Great Britain and other European countries would pressure Spain to rescind the treaty. But eventually, word gets out, and in response to that, and to the knowledge that the French now control Louisiana, Jefferson sends a delegation led by James Madison to meet with Napoleon in France to basically see if the French would sell the port of New Orleans to the United States. One of the drawbacks of the Western expansion was that until the purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, and then the building of the Erie Canal, which connected Lake Erie with the Hudson River, it was very difficult to ship the agricultural surplus of the Ohio and Tennessee River valleys. The Erie Canal and then the Louisiana Purchase essentially opened up the Mississippi River and the Hudson River as a trade route for the agricultural surplus of the Ohio and the Tennessee River valleys, essentially the upper Midwest. It was the Erie Canal that essentially funneled a lot of the agricultural output of the Midwest into New York, which is the beginning of the transformation of New York into a major seaport and the financial capital of the United States. Until then, there was really no way of shipping that surplus, which creates another interesting sidebar, which is the only way to preserve the caloric and economic value of any surplus corn that was being produced in the region was to convert it into alcohol, into moonshine. So until these two events, virtually every farm, every settlement in the region west of the Appalachians had a still, and they were as common as a baking oven because that was the only way of preserving the value of any surplus corn. And in fact, small barrels of whiskey, what were called pony barrels because they could be transported to each on a pony, were a unit of exchange and a unit of value. When Abraham Lincoln's father bought the family farm in Illinois, the purchase price included several barrels, pony barrels, of whiskey. That's how whiskey came to be established in the Midwest. And then after the Louisiana Purchase and the Erie Canal, when it was no longer required to convert your surplus grain into moonshine, the practice died out, except for those areas of the Midwest, namely Kentucky and Tennessee, where the presence of limestone made the water particularly ideal for producing whiskey, which is how we ended up with a whiskey industry in Tennessee and in Kentucky, but it generally died out everywhere else in the Midwest. Now, when Madison got to Paris, Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, advised him that the French had no interest in selling the port of New Orleans, but they were interested in selling the entire territory of Louisiana. He also told Madison that the U.S. had 30 days in which to make up their mind whether they wanted to buy it, and that the French were also negotiating with another party. Now, the latter wasn't true, but of course, Madison had no way of knowing that, and the fear was that if that other party was Great Britain, then in effect, the United States would find themselves again hemmed in by British territories to the north and to the west. Now, Madison's mandate had been to buy the port of New Orleans and any surrounding territory that was available. Jefferson had never imagined that the French would sell the entire territory of Louisiana. And 30 days was too short a period of time to get a ship back to across the Atlantic to Jefferson to get instructions and for that ship to return. So Madison decides, knowing of Jefferson's interest in the entire territory, to go ahead and offer to buy the entire Louisiana territory, even though his original mandate had been just the city of New Orleans. And the American delegation eventually reaches an agreement with the French to buy the entire territory. Now, when Jefferson gets news that Madison has struck a deal to buy the entire Louisiana territory, he's ecstatic. I mean, Jefferson had had a long-standing interest not only in securing Louisiana for the United States, but actually exploring the territory and the region west of the Louisiana territory. He had tried unsuccessfully on several occasions to get Congress to basically fund missions of exploration through the Louisiana territory into the West, and Congress had declined to do that long before there was a Lewis and Clark expedition. So Jefferson is ecstatic. This is the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. But Jefferson's aides rather tell him that, well, there's a couple of problems to this. First of all, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the President of the United States can acquire land on behalf of the country. The second issue was that based on the original colonies that had been set up by the British, their charters, remember, had extended westward without limit. So technically, all of this territory was also being claimed by the original 13 colonies. And Jefferson was told all of the colonies would have to agree to having the United States essentially acquire this territory, or the United States would have to acquire it and then parcel it out to the colonies based on the original terms of their land grants. Jefferson basically tells his aides, I'm going to do this, you figure out how to make it happen. And so eventually they decide that the best way of doing this is by way of a treaty with France to settle a number of French debts and a number of other matters between France and the United States. And the purchase of Louisiana is one of those issues, although it's the principal issue. And then, of course, that goes to the Senate to get ratified. Now, you would have thought that the Senate would have been all in favor of the Louisiana Purchase, but in fact, it was a fairly close vote. And there were a number of northern senators who opposed the purchase for fear that this would result in an expansion of slavery into the region. In any case, the sale eventually goes through. But while all of this is happening, France has still not formally taken possession of the Louisiana territory from Spain. It finally does that right at the time that the sale closes with the United States. So not only is this the first real estate flip in history, it is also to this day the largest real estate flip in history. And in fact, in St. Louis, they still celebrate what they call Flag Day, where the flag of Spain came down and the flag of France went up, and then the flag of France, as France took formal possession of the Louisiana territory, and then the flag of France came down and the flag of the United States went up, signaling the transfer of the Louisiana territory to the United States. In St. Louis, they call it Three Flags Day. It actually occurred over 2 days, March 9th and March 10th. But nonetheless, the French essentially took possession of Louisiana and within 24 hours essentially flipped it to the United States. Now, there's one last little sidebar that adds another very interesting dimension to all of this. When the Spanish were negotiating the Third Treaty of Ildefonso, at the very last minute, the Spanish delegation insisted on a provision that if France decided they did not want the Louisiana territory anymore, they had to give it back to Spain. Now, at that point, the treaty was more or less done, ready to be signed. And so the French delegation said, well, we don't want to have to revise the treaty again. We'll simply have a side agreement agreeing to your request. Well, that side agreement was never actually signed. So fast forward to 1814, the Napoleonic War has ended, although Napoleon would escape from Elba and there would be one final battle at Waterloo the next year. But at the Congress of Vienna, some 200 different countries, principalities, whatnot, were in attendance to decide on the post-Napoleonic organization of Europe. So the United States was not a formal member of the Congress of Vienna because they had not participated in the Napoleonic Wars, but they did send observers. And there is an account from the head of the Spanish delegation, Gomez de Labrador, where he reports to his superiors that he ran into one of the American observers at the Congress of Vienna and proceeded to explain to him that Napoleon never actually had the right to sell Louisiana to the United States and that Spain wanted the territory back. Now, he never identifies who the American representative was that he spoke with, nor what the exact reply that the American gave him, except to note that the American responded in what Gomez de Labrador described a rude fashion. You can imagine what the response was. But this is why the Battle of New Orleans in 1814 was so critical, because New Orleans was the key to controlling the Mississippi, and Mississippi was the key to controlling the Louisiana territory. Had the English prevailed at the Battle of New Orleans, then they would have been in a much stronger position to potentially force some kind of revision or compromise over the American purchase of Louisiana from the French. As it was, Andrew Jackson successfully held off the British, won the Battle of New Orleans, and at that point, it made the Louisiana Purchase a fait accompli. Spain was in no position to force the United States to give up Louisiana. The only country that could have potentially done that was Great Britain. And having now fought 2 wars already against the United States, and having fought France almost continuously for a period of 150 years, Great Britain was in no mood to find or to start yet another war. So in effect, the purchase of the Louisiana territory by the United States was retained, even though to this day it remains unclear whether Napoleon in fact had the right to sell the territory in the first place. As part of the Treaty of Paris, Cuba and the Philippines, which had been conquered by the British, were returned to Spain. France retained St. Pierre and Miquelon, 2 islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, plus fishing rights to the Grand Banks and access to what came to be called the French shore. They also retained Guadeloupe, St. Lucia, and Martinique. Now remember, this is the height of the West Indies sugar boom. The West Indies are the most valuable real estate on earth. And during the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain offers to return French Canada to France in return for the islands of Guadeloupe, St. Lucia, and Martinique. And the French reject that offer on the ground that it was inadequate compensation for those 3 islands. From roughly the late 15th century through the middle of the 19th century, the cod fishery on the Grand Banks represents the single largest source of animal protein anywhere in the world. It was also the cheapest. So salt cod is what was fed to armies. It what was fed to slaves on the sugar plantations of the West Indies. It's why salt cod features so prominently in the cuisine of the West Indies, even though the nearest cod fishery is thousands of miles away. Salt cod became ubiquitous in the Mediterranean, for example, even though there is no cod fishery in the Mediterranean. Now, to be able to take advantage of the cod fishery in the absence of refrigerated ships, the fish had to be salted. And there were 2 ways of doing that, what was called wet salting and dry salting. In wet salting, the fish were basically gutted and then packed into barrels in between alternating layers of salt. In dry salting, the fish were gutted and then landed on shore and salted and dried. Now, that was a much better way of preserving the fish. It allowed you to preserve them longer. It also allowed you to pack more fish onto the ships. But to do that, you needed the right to essentially land on the shore and take out your fish and dry them. So part of the Treaty of Paris gave the French the rights to land on Newfoundland and dry their salted cod. And the area of Newfoundland coast that was made available to them was called the French shore. And it's still called that to this day. And you can see on the map, originally the French shore was the northern portion of Newfoundland, which is, of course, directly opposite where the cod fishery was, which was at the southeast corner of Newfoundland. And it just made it that much harder for the French. And then eventually in 1783, as a consequence of the treaties that ended the American War of Independence, the French shore was transferred to the western side of Newfoundland. But one of the articles, I believe it's Article 3 or Article 4 of the treaty that ended the American War of Independence, gave the United States fishing rights and access to the to Newfoundland so they could dry their cod catch. And that portion of Newfoundland is to this day still called the American shore. The elimination of the French threat to the American colonies was really the most important consequence of the French and Indian War in North America. It also left a significant legacy of debt to the British government. And in an effort to prevent Western expansionism, which the British did not deem in their interest, and which they felt essentially caused conflict on the frontier, which they would then have to police at their expense by stationing British troops there. In 1763, Parliament passed the Proclamation of 1763, which essentially preserved a very large portion of the region between the Mississippi and the Appalachians for the exclusive use of Native Americans. This was, in effect, the first Indian reservation on North America. And then 11 years later, in what was called the Spoils of War Act, or officially the Quebec Act, virtually all of the rest of the region, essentially the upper Midwest, between the Mississippi and where the Indian Reserve had been established, was joined to the province of Quebec. So essentially, it stymied any additional Western expansion by the original 13 colonies. The end of the French and Indian War sets the stage for a series of events that would ultimately culminate in the American War of Independence. And in those events, the city of Boston and the surrounding region would come to play a critical role. And that will be the next topic that I'm going to discuss. The 7 Years' War leaves Great Britain virtually bankrupt. The British government debt doubles from 70 million to almost 135 million pounds. So Parliament decides that they need to increase the government's revenues. And they do this in a number of ways. One is by strictly enforcing a policy of mercantilism. Mercantilism is essentially an economic policy or a trade policy that seeks to maximize exports, minimize imports, and create as large a balance of trade surplus as possible. Parliament also realizes that they need to raise taxes, not only to offset the higher costs of British military deployment around the world, but also to start chipping away at this enormous debt that was created by the fighting of the 7 Years' War. And they also decide they need to establish firmer control over the colonies. And this really had to do with Western expansionism. Remember that the principal revenue source that was coming from North America was the fur trade. And the Native American communities were an integral part of the fur trade. Most of the fur-bearing animals were actually trapped by Native Americans, and then they were brought to various trading stations operated by the Hudson Bay Company, where they were exchanged for various goods. So maintaining that system, which was an enormous source of profits for the Hudson Bay Company and by extension for the British government, was important. And Western expansionism not only threatened that business, but it tended to also inflame relations between Native Americans and the settlers, which would invariably necessitate the British government to police the frontier or to increase their expenditures for troops in North America. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that every country has what I call their creation mythology, essentially the explanation of how they came to be. Now, in ancient cultures, these creation mythologies could be quite fanciful, like, for example, the Roman account of Rome being founded by Romulus and Remus, two infants that were abandoned in the wild and nurtured by a she-wolf. But the United States also has a creation mythology, if you will, a narrative explaining the reasons for the creation and birth of the United States. And they essentially revolve around the fact that tyrannical and despotic King George III imposed all sorts of unfair taxes on the American colonists, taxes that were imposed without any kind of American or colonial representation, and that this would eventually lead to a democratic revolution and the expulsion of the British from the 13 colonies. There is a shred of truth to that, but most of that is actually fiction. King George III was obstinate and stubborn, and certainly didn't do anything to placate relationships between Great Britain and the American colonies. But none of the taxes came from King George. All of the taxes came from Parliament. The British had fought a civil war in the 16th century to establish once and for all that the right to levy taxes was vested in Parliament and not in the Crown. So all of those taxes that the Americans colonists found objectionable weren't being imposed by King George. They were being imposed by Parliament. But rebelling against a tyrannical, despotic king makes a much better narrative than rebelling against the mother of all parliaments. So that's how the story essentially has been fashioned. These days, folks often complain about how politics is all about spin and narrative, but This is nothing. This is nothing new. Spin and narrative were as true in 1776 as they are today, and the American Revolution was cast as this revolt against a tyrannical king and his unreasonable taxes, when in fact the king had really nothing to do with those taxes. And interestingly enough, the taxes that were being imposed were really not all that unreasonable, as we'll find out over the next few minutes. So Parliament now passes or enforces a series of acts that lead to growing domestic unrest in the American colonies. Now, the Navigation Acts actually dated back to 1651, but had never really been enforced consistently by the British government. And the Navigation Act simply stated that the colonies were not allowed to trade with any other country except Great Britain and her colonies. And the idea was to preserve as much of the trade within the English realm, within the Britain and the colonies, in order to retain as much of the profit of that trade. Now, that was followed, and really the first significant act of taxation was the Sugar Act in 1764. And this is really the beginning of the political unrest and agitation that would eventually culminate 11 years later in the beginning of the American War of Independence. Now, the interesting thing is that the Sugar Act wasn't really about sugar. It was about molasses. And that's a very interesting story in its own right. Molasses is a byproduct of the refining of sugar. And remember, in the 18th century, the West Indies is undergoing an absolutely incredible sugar boom. Now, the French government, in order to protect the cognac industry in France, had limited the amount of molasses that could be converted into rum. Molasses was a byproduct of sugar refining, but there really wasn't much you could do with molasses except ferment it and use it as a base to produce rum. Now, the New England had emerged as one of, if not the principal rum producer in the world. It was producing roughly about 5 million plus gallons of rum a year from about 2 or 3 dozen odd distilleries. Barbados was the only other place that was producing an equal quantity of rum. Now, rum was a very important industry in the 13 colonies. It represented somewhere around 70 to 80% of New England's export earnings. And the production of rum drove all sorts of other industries like barrel making and ironmongering and whatnot. The sugar boom had produced enormous fortunes in the West Indies. The typical sugar plantation generated a return of approximately 100% on invested capital every year. And that's before taking in the profits of also producing rum from the molasses that was left over. So all of those sugar plantation owners, as soon as they had their plantations established and working well, basically hightailed it back to England, bought themselves, splendid estates, ideally with titles, and also bought themselves parliamentary seats. So what was called the sugar lobby or the sugar barons represented the single largest voting bloc in Parliament. Now, the sugar barons were incredibly wealthy. They were so wealthy that George III actually stipulated that no one could have a fancier carriage than the king, could have more footmen or more horses than the king had on his carriage. And the king was always allowed 2 more horses and 2 more footmen than any other carriage. In the 18th century, carriages were sort of the 21st century equivalent of billionaire yachts. It was a very ostentatious way of showing off your wealth. And the sugar barons were so rich that they even put the monarchy to shame. So what the sugar barons wanted was to prevent the American colonies from buying cheap molasses from the West Indies. What they wanted from the French West Indies, what they wanted was to cause the colonists to have to buy their molasses in Bristol and Liverpool from molasses that was being produced in the British West Indies. Well, that would have increased the price of molasses significantly for the American colonists. And given how important the rum industry was in the colonies, this was a major problem. Roughly 3/4 of the founding fathers of the United States were either rum distillers, investors in rum distilleries, or lawyers that represented rum distilling interests. That's an aspect of the American War of Independence that we don't really dwell on, because it seems unseemly to say, well, one of the causes of the War of Independence was that the British were messing around with our very lucrative rum business, and we took objection to that. But in fact, the Sugar Act was about molasses, not about sugar. And eventually, the Sugar Act was amended, and the requirements to buy only British molasses were relaxed. But nonetheless, by then, the agitation that would eventually lead to the American War of Independence had started. That was followed by the Stamp Act, which essentially imposed a tax of a stamp on all legal documents, including newspapers. Now, if you had a legal document that wasn't properly stamped, it meant that that document did not have standing in law. So it was absolutely essential to acquire the stamps to affix to any kind of legal document that you were signing. And of course, this turned out to be highly objectionable to the colonists. This was followed by the Declaratory Act, where Parliament basically declared that it had the right to impose laws on the colonies. Now, no one had really, it had always been assumed that Parliament had the right to impose laws on the colonies, and the colonists themselves thought of themselves as citizens of Britain. But this was simply a more formal restatement by Parliament that, in fact, they had the authority to impose these laws. And that would lead shortly thereafter to what was called the townshend duties, which were duties imposed by the Crown on all sorts of goods like lead and glass and whatnot that could not be produced in the colonies and which had to be imported. And to make these duties more palatable, rather than taxing them separately, the tax was included in the purchase price of the goods. But everyone realized that, in fact, the British government was levying taxes on these goods. Now, the Townshend Act was eventually repealed, but the agitation that it caused would eventually lead to the Boston Massacre in 1770, when a group of Bostonians were harassing some British soldiers, and the soldiers opened fire, killing a number of citizens. The first actual act of premeditated violence against British interests also occurs in Boston, and that's the Boston Tea Party. Now, everyone has heard about the Boston Tea Party, how a group of Americans dressed up as Indians and raided a number of English ships in the harbor to protest the taxes that were being imposed on the tea that was being shipped to the British colonies, to the American colonies. Again, that's the narrative. That's not really what happened. In 1698, Parliament had given the East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade. But to ensure that the East India Company not abuse its monopoly position, the terms of the monopoly required the East India Company to sell its tea by public auction, so that there was in effect a free market to actually purchase the tea. Now, Parliament imposed all kinds of taxes on the tea trade, to the point that the East India Company was having trouble selling its tea, because its tea was the most expensive tea generally being put up for sale. And a number of countries, principally the Dutch, had a very active business smuggling tea to various British colonies, including the 13 colonies in North America, and selling that tea at a reduced price. So the East India Company went to Parliament and in effect said, we are in danger of going out of business because the taxes that you are imposing on the tea trade have made us uncompetitive around the world, and you have not succeeded in preventing other countries, principally the Dutch, from selling tea into our markets. So Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, rescinding many of the taxes that the government had imposed on the tea trade, except for one tax of 3 pence per pound that was levied on the tea. And the East India Company, as following that, dispatched 7 ships laden with tea to the American colonies in North America, 1 each to Charleston, New York, and Philadelphia, and 4 ships to Boston. It shows you how important Boston was economically and within the 13 colonies, that Boston and New England would have gotten 4 of the 7 tea ships that were dispatched to the 13 colonies. Now, the idea was that the tea would have been consigned to representatives of the East India Company in Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. And they would take this tea on a consignment basis, sell it, and then remit the money back to the East India Company. Well, in New York and Philadelphia, the agents resigned, so there was no one there to actually take possession of the tea. In Charleston, the agent refused to take possession, so it ended up being taken over by the port. But in Boston, the agents for the British East India Company were the 2 sons of the British governor, Hutchinson. So they could not resign or fail to carry out their duties. So in effect, they were ready to take possession of the tea and resell it to British merchants. But the effect of rescinding all of these taxes on the tea meant that the tea from the East India Company was now the cheapest tea available in New England. And New England merchants were all stocked up on what was now more expensive tea that they had bought from the Dutch. So they concocted this idea of essentially destroying the tea to prevent it from being sold into the Boston market, because they would have had ruinous financial losses as a result of cheaper tea arriving in Boston. So the Boston Tea Party was not about a protest to essentially dispute the taxes, the high taxes being imposed by the British on the tea. It was really an attempt by Boston merchants to get rid of a bunch of cheaper tea that was now being introduced into Boston as a result of Parliament rescinding many of the taxes that had been imposed on the tea from the British East India Company. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the Sons of Liberty, or what were called the true-born Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Mohawks, somewhere between 30 and 130 Mohawk Indians, dumped 342 chests of tea off of Griffin Wharf in what is now Pearl Street in Boston. It represented roughly 9,000 pounds of tea, the equivalent of about 1.7 million US dollars. This was the first premeditated act of violence against British interests, and as I mentioned earlier, it occurs in Boston. Now, the Boston Tea Party was extremely controversial. Both Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, for example, came out publicly against it and insisted that it was an act of vandalism and that the vandals had to be identified and be forced to pay compensation to the East India Company for the tea they had destroyed. In the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passes the Coercive Acts, or also called in America, the Intolerable Acts, in 1774, where they take control and close the port of Boston, effectively take over control of the Massachusetts government and of the courts, and the most controversial of all, the Quartering Acts, which gave the British military the right to quarter or place British troops in the private homes of citizens. Now, in reality, the number of British troops that were actually stationed or quartered in the homes of private citizens was minuscule, but it nonetheless proved to be inflammatory. In response to the British retaliation against Boston, the colonies organized the First Continental Congress. And this is really the beginning of the 13 colonies acting in unison in trying to craft a common response to British actions. At the same time, there is a confrontation in Boston on March the 5th, 1770, where a mob of Bostonians confronts British soldiers on King Street. And they are throwing insults at the soldiers, they are pelting them with stones and horse dung, and provoking the soldiers. And it's not really entirely clear to this day what actually happened or who actually gave the order to fire, but the British soldiers opened fire and 5 Bostonians were killed and 6 were injured. Now, remarkably, John Adams, who was arguably one of the leading, if not the leading lawyer in Boston at the time, agrees to act for the soldiers that are being accused of murder. And he actually conducts what is being described as a brilliant defense, and 6 of the soldiers are acquitted of any charges, and 2 are convicted of a lesser charge of manslaughter rather than murder. It was extremely controversial for Adams to do this, and he was roundly criticized by many Bostonians for defending the British soldiers. Which brings us finally to what I will call the beginning of revolution. And really the starting bell, the starting gun of that is the ride of Paul Revere on April 8, 1775. Now, this is another example where myth and spin or narrative outweighs the facts. Much of what we think we know or accept as the history of the ride of Paul Revere is really the result of the poem by Longfellow, The Ride of Paul Revere, and is in fact not true, although it is grounded in some historical facts. So what happened is that Joseph Warren recruits Paul Revere, William Dawes, and up to 30 other riders to alert the militias in the case of the British Army leaving Boston. Now, Revere instructs Robert Newman, who's the deacon of the North Church in Boston, to place lanterns in the bell tower to indicate which way the British were traveling. Now, the expression, one if by land, two if by sea, was in fact invented by Longfellow in his poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. There were no such instructions or no such terms used by Paul Revere. The British could advance in one of two ways. By land meant that they were going to travel due west along what is now more or less the route of I-90 in Boston. By sea meant that they were going to cross the Charles River in rowboats and then go along the north bank of the Charles. Now, that was a shorter route, but there weren't enough rowboats to transfer the entire British Army in one fell swoop. And so the British would have had to cross the Charles in groups, and the British commander was unwilling to split up the force while to get everyone across the Charles, so they elected to go by land. That's where the distinction, one of by land, two of by sea, comes from. By sea meant that they were going to cross the Charles, not that they were traveling actually by sea. In any case, that expression came from Longfellow, not from Revere or anybody else. There were a total of 40 riders that spread the alarm. Revere, for his part, was generally ineffectual, because shortly after he leaves, he's stopped by a British roadblock, and he's detained until the following morning. So in effect, Revere really doesn't tell anyone that the British Army is on the march, because he's basically held by the British during the night. And contrary to popular belief, the riders didn't say the British are coming, because in 1775, the vast majority of colonists considered themselves British. So to say the British are coming would have been nonsensical. What they said was the regulars are coming, which was how the British infantry were referred to. Of course, Longfellow immortalizes Paul Revere in his poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. You might remember having memorized that when you were probably in the 5th or 6th grade. Listen, my children, and you will hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Nary a man is still alive who remembers that fateful day and year. That's the only part that I remember. But in any case, Longfellow's poem, to a large extent, replaced the actual history of what happened. Lexington and Concord also represents the beginning of the United States Army. Before there even was a United States, there was a United States Army. And that army first was bloodied at Lexington and at Concord. The official flag of the United States Army has a ribbon, color-coded, to correspond to the major wars fought by the United States. And each of those ribbons, roughly 4 feet long and about 2 3/4 of an inch wide, commemorates a particular battle. And the very first ribbon, the very first battle, is Lexington. Now, why did the British actually march on Lexington and Concord? The official reason was that they were looking to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. In reality, and that was certainly a reason, and they would have gladly have arrested them if they had had the opportunity. But in fact, that wasn't the real reason why they were marching on Lexington and Concord. The real reason was gunpowder. Gunpowder consists of 75% potassium nitrate, what was called saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. There was no source of saltpeter in the 13 colonies, and there was only one small gunpowder mill. All of the saltpeter in North America was coming basically from the Caribbean, and it was associated with what was referred to as guano deposits, which are these enormous deposits of bird droppings that have literally piled up over hundreds, if not thousands of years. And these droppings were very rich in potassium nitrate, and the potassium nitrate would be extracted from these bird droppings, and it was be used to make gunpowder. Gunpowder was absolutely critical to the conduct of the war, and anticipating that, in 1774, the British government had banned the export of gunpowder to the American colonies. And what the British wanted to do was to seize all of the available gunpowder in the colonies. And if they had done that, it would have pretty much stopped the American War of Independence before it ever started. When George Washington took command of the Continental Army, he was promised that there were at least 1,000 barrels of gunpowder at his disposal, roughly 100,000 pounds of gunpowder. To his absolute horror, in July of 1775, when he takes command of the Continental Army, then encamped outside of Boston, he discovers that he only has about 40 barrels of usable gunpowder. And the rest had either been used or had been ruined because it had been exposed to the elements. Well, it was impossible to conduct a war. In fact, it was impossible to even fight a battle with only 40 barrels of gunpowder. So the Americans attempted to steal gunpowder from British stores in Bermuda and in Halifax. And were able to obtain some gunpowder from Bermuda, although on the whole, very little, certainly none of what was needed to conduct the American War of Independence. The French would end up supplying 90+% of all of the gunpowder that was used by the Americans during the War of Independence, roughly 3 million pounds of gunpowder. Initially, this was done via the Dutch in St. Martin, and then eventually directly by the French. The French spent 1.2 billion livres, the equivalent today of $250 billion, supplying those 3 million pounds of gunpowder to the Continental Army. It almost bankrupted the French government, and it was one of the causes that contributed to the French Revolution a few years later. So that brings us essentially to the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And then from Lexington and Concord, the United States Army, the Continental Army, would go on to fight for the next 7-8 years, until finally the British surrendered at Yorktown, which at the time was not considered the end of the War of Independence, because it was assumed that the English would restart operations at some point, possibly reinforce the troops they already held in North America. But as it was, Great Britain decided not to pursue the war any further. So Yorktown marks the end of military operations in the American War of Independence, even though a treaty would not be signed for several more years. So let me leave you with some conclusions. The French and Indian War marked the culmination of a 100-year Anglo-French struggle to control North America. The British victory in the French and Indian War set the stage for the American Revolution, because it essentially eliminated the threat that France had posed to the 13 colonies. And at the same time, it sets the stage for what would transition into an Anglo-American rivalry to control North America. The French and Indian War changed the British attitude towards the colonies. And as I said, it also eliminated the threat that France posed to the colonies. England at that point needed more help from the colonies to retire the debt that had been incurred in part because of their defense, and also for the ongoing costs that were required to permanently station British troops there. In fact, the taxes that were imposed on the United States or on the American colonies was less than the corresponding taxes that were being imposed in Great Britain. But nonetheless, that became a primary source of agitation and eventually conflict between the colonies and Great Britain. Boston was ground zero for the American War of Independence. Every major escalation in the events that would eventually culminate in the American War of Independence began in Boston. The first act of premeditated violence, the first drawing of blood, the first actual military conflict, all of those began in Boston. The Revolutionary War would end in Virginia, in Yorktown, but began in Boston. And without the role of Boston as a catalyst, it might well not have happened. I hope you found this short talk interesting. As I said, there is a mythology of the War of Independence, of the creation mythology of the United States, and many of the events that have been wrapped up in that narrative are actually quite interesting in and of their own right, especially because what really happened is somewhat at odds with what is generally accepted, and for that matter, what is generally taught in schools to children. Nonetheless, the result of all this was the birth of the United States, and the rest, as they say, is history. So thanks for joining us. For those who ask, my next Viking trip is going to be on the Viking Sky starting June 25th in Athens for the next 3 weeks. So if by chance you're going to be on that cruise, come and find me. I will be there. I'm usually on deck 1 at the coffee bar having my morning coffee. Thanks for joining us, and have a good day. Thank you.